911, where's your emergency?
Hi, I'm in Cook City right now, and we had someone that's been attacked and bitten pretty badly by a bear.
On July 21st, 2010, a woman was jogging on Highway 212, stretching between Yellowstone National Park's northeast entrance and Cook City. With the small community of Silvergate nestled just a few miles in between, she jogged through the lush alpine area, enjoying the scenery, when suddenly she stopped in her tracks when a female grizzly with 3 cubs walked out of the woods and onto the road. The bears immediately noticed this woman, and the protective sow stands up on her hind legs to get a better look at her and see if she's a potential threat. The cubs, on the other hand, who are yearlings, meaning they're still capable of doing damage, would at this point panic and in a split second start running down the side of the road towards this woman. Despite her body begging her to run, the woman would, fortunately for her, listen to her logic instead. Holding her ground, she raised her arms and tried to look as big as possible, while yelling, "Hey, hey!" causing the grizzly sow, who'd also begun charging as well, to halt, and quickly but cautiously herd her cubs back into the woods. With her adrenaline now pumping, the woman quietly but in hurried fashion heads to the ranger station, where she recounts her experience to park rangers, writes a bear report, while at the same time breathing a long sigh of relief for managing to get away from the bears unscathed. Just a week later, the Wilhelm family settled into their campsite within the upper loop of the Soda Butte Campground, a popular location situated in a forested valley just 5 miles north of Yellowstone. The campground boasted 27 separate sites, each of them strategically placed among clusters of conifer trees, offering campers a sense of privacy as well as personal space. And unlike the more common tightly packed setups, these sites are spread out across a medium-sized campground, allowing for a more secluded camping experience. Not to mention, it's also only about 3/4 of a mile from Cook City, which makes getting extra supplies or food or whatever's needed really convenient. Now, this campground also butts up against Soda Butte Creek, which is this really beautiful mountain creek. It's somewhat big for a creek, and it also keeps the campground quite cool in the warmer summer months. The Wilhelms had traveled from Texas for their family vacation at Yellowstone. The parents, Paige and Don, were extremely happy to be resting from an eventful day with their 2 sons on the night of July 27th. Don, who was a wildlife biologist, was especially excited about this trip because he understood that Yellowstone was a complete ecosystem in the Rockies, which still had all the original wildlife that you could find there hundreds of years ago, which includes everything from small animals like yellow-bellied marmots to, of course, big animals like grizzly bears. Now, by all accounts, that evening in the campground was pretty uneventful and was just a normal and peaceful camping evening. But that peace was shattered at 2 a.m. when the Wilhelms suddenly were woken up by screams. Not far away in the upper loop of the campground, couple Ronald and Maria had been fast asleep in their tent with their dog, when suddenly they're woken up to their tent being moved several feet all at once, at which point Ronald would suddenly feel intense, painful pressure as something large bit down on his leg. He would instinctually begin punching the mystery assailant, causing it to let go and disappear. Now at this point, it's clear that he's been bitten by something big, which was able to move the entire tent by grabbing him, and so it was no surprise that knowing this, even looking out of the tent through a hole that the animal had ripped in the screen, caused him to shake in his boots. Despite his fear, he would go ahead and do so anyway, and just moments later realized the coast is clear. Maria at this point turns on a light as the couple examined his leg, which was completely torn open with 2 large lacerations down to the bone. Back at the Wilhelms campsite, they'd heard Ron and Maria's screams, and a lot of shuffling noises from the campground, just a handful of sites down in the upper loop of Soda Butte. And for 10 minutes they laid in silence, doing their best to interpret what these screams could mean. Initially thinking these were just rowdy teenagers, or maybe it was a domestic fight, they'd suddenly hear new screams erupt in another campsite, and this time the screams were even closer, in fact just a couple of campsites away. This is when the Wilhelms realized that these were no rowdy teenagers, these were no hooligans, but this was something much worse. Just moments following these screams, the Wilhelms would then hear a woman yelling, "It's a bear! I've been attacked by a bear!" The 58-year-old Canadian woman had been fast asleep in her tent when a noise and some movement would wake her up, and just moments later she had felt teeth grinding into her arm, realizing she was being attacked by a bear. She said, "I realized that split second I was being attacked by a bear, but I couldn't see it. It was behind me and I screamed. I couldn't help it. It was kind of like somebody else was screaming, and it continued to bite into me some more and even harder. it got very aggressive and then started to shake me, which is when I kept screaming, and I realized at this point that if I don't do something, I'm gonna die. So I decided at that point the only thing I knew to do was to play dead, especially when it came to grizzly bears, so I just went totally limp, got very quiet, and didn't make a sound. That was when just a few seconds later, after realizing I was no longer a threat, or thinking it neutralized me, the bear then dropped me and walked away. She also felt like the bear was quiet when it was attacking, and she couldn't help but feel that she was being hunted. The Wilhelms at this point sat quietly in their tent, trying their best not to attract the bears. But unfortunately, just moments later, they would hear some soft huffing and shuffling noises coming from outside their tent, causing them to instantly react. The couple grabs their children, 2 boys, aged 12 and 9, managed to make it to their minivan and quickly drive up to the nearest campsite where they heard the woman screaming. Upon arriving, they saw her laying on her sleeping bag near her flattened tent, her arm crushed and bloodied. But because the bears could still be nearby, the couple is watching all this from inside their minivan, afraid that if they were to come out, their lives could be at risk. This is when they decide to drive through the upper campsite loop and blare their horn as much as they could in an effort to not only scare the bears away, but also warn other campers that may not be aware of the immediate danger. Unfortunately, however, they hadn't taken their van to the more secluded and much more quiet lower loop, which is exactly the direction that the bears were heading. The bears were approaching Site 26, which is one of the more desirable campsites in the lower loop, both because it's close to the creek and because it's the first campsite after the big gap between the lower and upper campsite, and not to mention it's even more secluded than the other campsites. 48-year-old Kevin Kammer, who at the time had been asleep at the campsite, had come out to fulfill a lifelong dream of fly fishing in Yellowstone National Park. An avid outdoorsman, he was a big-time fly fisherman who loved kayaking and was a married, stay-at-home dad with 4 kids from Michigan. He had set up a small orange and yellow tent on the day of July 27th and was no doubt planning his next fishing outing. As he blissfully laid down to go to sleep on the evening of July 27th, he of course was unaware that this would be the last night of his life. In the middle of the night, the distance from the upper loop and the sound of the creek was more than enough to drown out the screams of the other campers, as well as the chaos happening just 100 yards away, and also much more than enough, of course, to mask the footsteps of an approaching bear family, as well as their airy woofs, as they tested the air with their powerful noses. As the bears got closer to Site 26, they would once again pick up the scent of what might be potential prey. And then it was at this point, in a really swift and almost singular action, they collapsed the tent, grabbed the stunt cabin camera from Kevin's head and shoulders, and rip him out of his sleeping bag and his tent. Back in the upper loop, both Ronald and Deb had been rushed to help, and emergency personnel had already been looking through their injuries. And officials from the Park County, Wyoming Sheriff's Department and the National Park Service were also clearing out the upper loop of all campers before commencing a search for the responsible bears. It was a little after 4 a.m. when they finally got to the lower loop and found Kevin's collapsed tent, just 10 feet away from which lay his remains. The upper half of his torso was almost completely consumed by the bears, and a large puddle of blood was about 4 feet away from his tent, which is likely where Kevin had been killed via exsanguination, which is another word for bleeding out, just in case you don't know. And often this is the case when it comes to death via bear attacks, because as mentioned on the channel before, the bear isn't dispatching the person, they're just feeding on them, and usually people die from bleeding out. Unlike cats, bears don't kill gracefully, they just hold their prey down and start chomping away. And usually this is bit by bit, so one can only imagine the agony, and one can only hope that Kevin passed away from the shock and didn't have to feel that much pain during the attack. The campers in the vicinity of Kevin's site, once again this was a very isolated site, they later report that they hadn't heard anything. In fact, a direct quote from one of the campers stated, "I didn't hear a woof, a growl, a moan, a whimper, nothing," meaning that these bears had truly discovered a quiet location which was perfect for predation. An immediate investigation was launched, and both prints and scat analysis would prove that the attackers were a bear family, and there had been one huge series of prints followed by several smaller sets. Authorities promptly set traps around the campsites and used bighorn sheep meat that they had available as bait. And it didn't take long to see results, as by 6 o'clock the very next evening, which was July 28th, the rest of the campground was completely evacuated and an adult grizzly bear had been successfully captured. The adult female grizzly was tranquilized and biological samples were obtained for examination. She was found to have a portion of her canine missing, and as mentioned before, the broken fragment of tooth that had fallen in Deb's tent during the attack, providing conclusive evidence that this was the responsible bear. However, despite this finding, they would still go on to conduct further DNA analysis as well as other related procedures. Upon capturing the female, they would not long after observe movement of the young offspring within some nearby willow trees. It was at this point that they would set some additional traps close to the original trap, and the female was then reintroduced into the trap, allowing her to recuperate from the administered tranquilizers. Now, this method proves highly effective in capturing young bears, as they tend to remain close in proximity to their mothers, and consequently these cubs were successfully captured using this approach. The bear family's relations were then confirmed through DNA research, and the female would then be humanely euthanized without delay. As for the cubs, it was decided that they weren't to be killed, but they also weren't to be released into the wild either, since they'd also fed on Kevin's body, which could very well have led them to being repeat offenders, having now tasted human meat. They were temporarily transported to a zoo, where they were held for a short time before being permanently moved to Utah's Hogle Zoo, where they remain to this day. Regarding their deceased mother, investigative reports and forensic analysis later revealed that this bear was not particularly large compared to other bears in the broader Yellowstone area, and she was also found to have a significantly high parasite load, although it is worth noting that this is commonplace amongst bears in general. Therefore, based on these findings, although she may have had some degree of nutritional strain, it is important to note that this sow was not severely malnourished, nor did she suffer from any significant incapacitating injuries, which are both factors when it comes to bears hunting humans that have been common observations in previous incidents. So through isotopic analysis of her canines, it was found that she was ironically enough in the top 8% of bears in terms of adhering to a plant-based diet, indicating that a whopping 92% of bears in this environment consumed more meat than her. Not to mention her system showed no presence of human remains prior to this incident whatsoever, meaning she lacked food conditioning, and this wasn't an adopted behavior. Numerous experts who have examined this case, such as Yellowstone bear management specialist Kevin Kammer, believe that there really is no plausible justification for why this bear chose to guide her cubs into a heavily populated campground, assault numerous campsites, and ultimately take the life of a man. The leading theories were that she discovered an abundant food supply with a high caloric content that did not require her to compete with other bears, as of course humans are easy prey, whereas others pointed to her being perhaps a very curious bear whose interest was piqued by the initial bite, which went on to elicit a predatory response. If this episode piqued your interest, then our previous episode, featuring one of the most brutal and notorious bear attacks of all time, is likely to do the same. You can find it on the end screen of this video.